Death. It was inevitable for everyone, but in Rosen it was something strange. There were no funerals, no quiet gatherings in remembrance. No one even spoke of it. The first time I noticed was when one of the regulars at the store, a friendly old man who always bought the same blend of tea, stopped showing up. I asked Esther about him, and with a casual shrug, she simply said he had died. The nonchalance in her response was baffling, almost chilling. I stared at her, searching her face for some sign of sadness or even recognition of the weight of what she'd just said. Instead, she met my gaze with an expression as serene as ever. I pressed her for details, questions tumbling out faster than I could contain them, but she pushed each aside with an almost practiced ease. After that, I began to notice it, the strange metallic tang in the air whenever someone died. It was faint at first, but unmistakable, lingering in a way that felt wrong, like a warning no one else seemed to heed. A bitter scent of rusted iron that caught in my throat and stung my nose. It gnawed at me, this thought of death in Rosen, creeping into quiet moments when I should have felt safe. I started to wonder what my own death would be like in this town. Would I simply vanish? Would people just accept it, turn the page as if I'd never existed? Would there be no mention, no farewell? Just a lingering scent in the air, faint and metallic, as if the town itself had swallowed me whole. It was a thought that chilled me to the bone, yet somehow no one else seemed haunted by it. Every night after the man from the lake stumbled into the store, I had trouble sleeping. His desperate eyes, his frantic words, it was as if he'd brought something dark and unsettling with him. And then there was Esther's reaction. Her sudden unease, the way she'd brushed off my questions about the lake, as if I were prying into forbidden territory. Lying in bed, I replayed the encounter over and over, each memory fueling an endless stream of questions. What was really out there, hidden in the shadows of this town? Why had I never heard of the lake until now? And what did Esther mean when she said people who lived by it got strange? The more I tried to shake it off, the deeper my curiosity burrowed. The stillness of the night pressed down on me, and I felt a strange pull, as though the lake itself was whispering, daring me to find the answers that no one wanted to speak of. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to find the lake. Esther's warning echoed in my mind, but it only seemed to amplify the pull I felt. I knew it was reckless, that maybe I was letting my curiosity get the better of me. But there was something about the lake, something about that man's haunted eyes, that I couldn't shake. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch, a puzzle I couldn't solve until I saw it for myself. Every quiet night since the encounter, the lake had lingered in my thoughts, an obsession creeping into every corner of my mind. I'd lie awake, imagining the water stretching out, dark and unknowable, waiting just beyond. Every quiet night since the encounter, the lake had lingered in my thoughts, an obsession creeping into every corner of my mind. I'd lie awake, imagining the water stretching out, dark and unknowable, waiting just beyond. The edges of the town. I had to see it with my own eyes to make sense of whatever strange energy had settled over Rosen. As dawn approached, I made up my mind. The decision felt both reckless and inevitable, as if it had been building in me long before I was even aware of it. As the first light of dawn crept through my window, I got dressed, my heart pounding with the quiet thrill of breaking an unspoken rule. I told myself it was just curiosity, that I needed answers to ease my mind, but a small part of me couldn't deny the fear that simmered just below the surface. The lake felt more like a forbidden secret than a body of water, and in a town that spoke so little of death, I couldn't help but wonder what it was hiding. I thought about the scent that lingered in the air after someone passed, that unmistakable smell of rusted iron that I could practically taste. It reminded me of the lake somehow, as if they were connected. I didn't know what I expected to find, but I couldn't turn back now. The questions that had haunted me every night were about to meet the light of day. I needed to find where the lake was, and luckily the library was always open. There had to be some maps in there. The library stood at the edge of the main square, a quaint, unassuming building I'd passed countless times, but had never ventured into. This early in the morning, the streets were still deserted, and a thick mist curled around the town, muting the colors of the buildings and casting everything in a washed-out grey. I pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside, half expecting it to be locked. But as always, it was open, filled with the faint scent of old paper and dust, the kind of place that felt frozen in time. Rows of shelves stretched into the shadows, and the dim light filtering through the windows made the place feel almost hollow. A lone lamp glowed on the far side of the room, illuminating the front desk, but there was no one around. It was just me, the quiet and the restless curiosity that had driven me here. I found the map section tucked away in a corner, the books worn and faded with age. Pulling one of the older volumes from the shelf, I spread it open on a nearby table, scanning it for any sign of the lake. My fingers trailed over the creased, yellowed pages as I traced the outline of the town. There was no mention of the lake anywhere within the town's limits, but my eyes drifted to the outskirts, just past the forests and hills that bordered Rosen. And there it was, barely a speck on the map, an unnamed body of water hidden away in the northern woods. Then I heard the door creak open behind me. I glanced over, and there stood Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson was the librarian, a tall, elderly man with a big, white, bushy beard. He looked like he was straight out of the late 1800s with the way he presented himself. I quickly closed the map book, feeling a bit like a child caught doing something I shouldn't. Mr. Matheson stepped forward, his cane tapping lightly against the floor. He wore a long, dark coat with silver buttons and a high collar. His presence somehow both gentle and imposing. His eyes, sharp and startlingly blue, settled on me with a curious gleam as he tilted his head. Early morning research, His voice was soft, almost grandfatherly, yet it carried an undertone that made me uneasy. Yes, I stammered, trying to keep my tone casual. Just learning about the town. Mr. Matheson nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on the map book as he leaned a little closer. A fine pursuit, understanding one's surroundings. Rosen has a lot of history. His eyes flickered to the book in my hands, his lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. "And I see you've stumbled upon the lake," he said, voice dropping to a murmur, as if the word itself were a secret. I swallowed, trying to ignore the sudden chill that washed over me. I didn't know there was a lake until recently. Mr. Matheson's gaze became distant, and for a moment it was as if he was looking at something only he could see. "The lake is an old place," he said quietly, choosing his words carefully. "Older than the town itself. Not many folks talk about it these days." He took a breath, as if weighing what to say next. "It's best left undisturbed." I hesitated, wondering if I should ask him the questions gnawing at me, but before I could, he raised a hand, his expression softening. "Curiosity can be a powerful force, but not everything needs uncovering, child." His tone was warm, almost protective. "Some things are best kept in the quiet shadows where they belong." He gave me one last long look, then turned away, his cane tapping rhythmically as he disappeared between the shelves. I stood there, staring at the spot where he'd been, a strange mixture of dread and fascination settling over me. The lake, this forbidden ancient place, wasn't just something to avoid. It was something deeper, something the town had purposefully buried in whispers and warnings. And now, despite Mr. Matheson's words, I felt the pull even stronger, as though the lake itself were calling me. Without thinking, I sprang from my seat and hurried after him, catching him just as he returned a book to the shelf. "But what's wrong with the lake?" I blurted out, the question spilling from my lips before I could rein it in. "Why shouldn't I go there?" He paused, his hand resting on the book's spine. His face, lined and weary, softened with a hint of something I couldn't place. Pity, perhaps, or regret. "By now you must know how this town feels about death," he said, his voice low, each word carrying a weight that seemed almost painful. I nodded slowly, feeling a chill settle over me. Mr. Matheson sighed deeply, his gaze drifting to some distant memory. "The mine up on the mountain has been running for years, decades. They drill deep, dredging up more than just rock and metal. There's sludge, toxins, all of it pouring into the streams. And where do you think those streams lead?" His eyes met mine, his gaze dark. The lake. A knot formed in my stomach as he continued, his voice tinged with sorrow. "We've lost several children to that lake," he said softly. "They thought it was just a place to swim, to play, but there's nothing safe about it now." His words lingered in the air, casting a heavy silence over us. I didn't know whether to believe him, but the sincerity in his voice made it hard to dismiss. His words hung heavy in the air, each one weighing on me like a truth I wasn't ready to face. If it was just that, if the lake was simply poisoned by the mine's toxins, why couldn't Esther have said it? Why didn't Mr. Matheson just start with that, instead of burying it in cryptic warnings? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that every lie, every half-truth, was rooted in something real. Maybe the lake was dangerous, poisoned by the mine, as he said, but there was something more lurking beneath the surface, something he wasn't telling me, something Esther wasn't telling me. The pull of the lake hadn't lessened, but now it felt different. It wasn't just a place of hidden danger, it was a mystery, something wrapped in layers of silence and half-truths. And the more I probed, the more I felt that the town, with its strange rituals and its avoidance of death, was hiding something far darker than I could have imagined. I was going to that lake. No more hesitation, no more cryptic warnings. I had to see it for myself, to understand what was truly hidden away from us. But as I stepped outside, a sudden wave of pain slammed into my head. It was as if my brain was screaming at me, urging me to stop, to turn back. The world around me seemed to shift, distorting and twisting in an instant. The once familiar streets were suddenly darker, the buildings decaying and crumbling, as if time itself had taken its toll in mere seconds. The pavement beneath my feet felt uneven, and the air was thick with something oppressive. I stood there, frozen in place, my breath catching in my throat. What was happening? The pain in my head intensified, and I felt a deep sense of dread flood over me. The town I had known for months, the town I had thought I understood, was unrecognizable. It was like I was standing in a twisted version of ROSEN, one that didn't belong in the present. Then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The pain in my skull dulled and the world returned to normal. The streets were quiet again, the buildings standing tall and intact, as if nothing had happened at all. I shook my head, trying to shake off the lingering sensation of unease. It didn't make sense. Was it a warning from my mind or something else? I didn't know, but I couldn't let it stop me. The lake was still out there, waiting. I continued to walk through the town, the silence pressing in from all sides. It was unnerving how empty it felt. The streets that had once been filled with the quiet hum of daily life now seemed abandoned, as though everyone had disappeared in an instant. The only sound was the soft shuffle of my footsteps on the pavement and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. Faint beams of early morning sunlight pierced the fog, casting delicate patterns on the street, but they only seemed to highlight the eerie stillness of everything around me. The town, once so familiar, now felt like a forgotten place, caught in a moment of suspended animation. I was alone here, truly alone, with only my thoughts for company. Questions raced through my mind, each one more urgent than the last. Why was the lake so forbidden? What did Mr. Matheson mean when he spoke of the children lost to it? And why did Esther's reaction feel so much like fear? Was there something in that water? Or was it something beyond the lake itself? Something far darker, buried deep within the town? Every corner I turned, I half expected to find the answers waiting for me, but there was nothing, only silence, only shadows. I reached the edge of the town, where a long-forgotten trail spiraled into the forest. The air grew heavier here, as if the very earth was holding its breath. The trees loomed ahead, their pitch-black leaves swaying with an unnatural stillness. A chill crept up my spine as my mind, already on edge, flashed back to my first arrival in this town. Those same dark trees had stood then, a silent witness to my uncertain steps. The memory stirred something deep within me, but I couldn't tell if it was a recollection or something my mind had conjured from the haze of all these strange sensations. Was this all just a hallucination, some warped episode of my mind unspooling in real time? But as I stood at the trail's entrance, the leaves beckoning me, the weight of reality felt too heavy to ignore. My hand twitched at my side, and without thinking, I reached out toward the nearest branch. The moment my fingers brushed against the black leaves, they disintegrated into dust, as if they were never truly there to begin with. It was like touching the remnants of a nightmare, something that wasn't supposed to exist. And yet here it was, crumbling under my touch. I pulled my hand back quickly, heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. What was happening here? Was this a part of the town's twisted reality, or was it something deeper, a truth hidden in the dark corners of my mind? The trail stretched before me, winding into the shadows, and despite the unease coursing through me, the pull was undeniable. I couldn't stop now. I couldn't turn back. I braced myself and continued onward, the weight of each step dragging me deeper into the woods. As I moved, the unmistakable smell that had become so familiar in this town, the heavy metallic tang of death, hit me once more. But this time it was sharper, more pungent, as if the very air had thickened with it. It stung my nose, filled my lungs, and before I could even try to fight it, tears began to well up in my eyes, blurring my vision. But I couldn't stop. No matter how much my body screamed for me to turn back, I pressed forward. I wouldn't stop. I couldn't. The deeper I ventured, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees, now withered and blackened, whispered in the wind, their twisted limbs reaching for me like gnarled hands. But it wasn't just the forest that unnerved me. It was the silence. An oppressive, suffocating quiet hung in the air, the usual sounds of life all but erased, leaving only the distant echo of my footsteps and the pounding of my heart. Then in the distance I heard something that shook me to my core. It sounded like a wolf's howl, a primal, mournful cry that sent a shiver crawling up my spine. But it wasn't right. It was distorted, fragmented, like something trying to escape from the depths of a nightmare. The sound fractured the air, twisting into unnatural tones, and for a moment I stood frozen, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My breath hitched in my throat. The howl echoed again, louder this time, reverberating through the trees like a warning. Or was it a beckoning? I didn't know which was worse, the fear creeping through my veins or the strange compulsion pulling me forward, deeper into the heart of the forest. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't. Not now. Not when I was so close. As I rounded the corner, I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of my mind, a shadow cast by the trees, a fleeting glimpse of something unnatural. But no, it was there, standing just beyond the reach of the dying light, a wolf. Except it wasn't right. The creature stood unnaturally still, its body twisted and malformed, as if the world itself had refused to let it exist in the way nature intended. Its fur was matted and dark, drenched in a black, viscous liquid that clung to its form like tar. The same liquid I had encountered all those months ago, a thick, oily substance that seemed to seep from the very heart of Rosen, from the ground, from the air. My heart skipped a beat, and the world around me felt as though it were tilting on its axis. My breath caught in my throat, and my legs felt like they might give way beneath me. I couldn't look away from the creature. Its eyes, dark, empty pools, were locked onto mine, as though it had been waiting for me to see it, to acknowledge it. Then, in the horrifying silence that followed, it hit me. This was the first animal I had seen since I arrived in Rosen. Not a single bird, not a single insect, not even a stray dog, only people. And this thing wasn't an animal, it was something else, something wrong. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, sending a tremor through my bones, and I realized with a sickening jolt that I wasn't alone. It had been waiting for me, just as the town had been ever since I arrived. The liquid on its fur shimmered in the dim light, dark and foreboding, as though it had been stained by something older than the town itself, something that should have never been unleashed. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. One moment, the twisted creature stood before me, its empty eyes boring into mine, the slick black liquid dripping from its form. The next, nothing. The air was still. The only sound was the rustling of the wind in the trees. But I felt it. I could still sense it. Its presence lingering in the air, in the shadows, in the very soil beneath my feet. It was there somewhere, watching me, waiting. My heart raced and I wanted to flee, to turn back to the safety of the town. But my feet wouldn't move. I was paralyzed. Why didn't I turn back? I had every reason to. I knew better. I should have known better. The warnings, the strange pull of the lake, the inexplicable deaths. What did I think I was going to find? The answers I was chasing were too dangerous. This town wasn't just hiding something. It was built on a foundation of secrets, each one darker than the last. But even as the weight of my foolishness pressed down on me, I couldn't stop. The need to know, to understand, was stronger than any fear. The twisted creatures, the strange liquid, the absence of life in Rosen, everything was connected and I couldn't walk away from it. Not now. With my heart still pounding in my chest, I pushed forward, away from the empty space where the wolf had been. I had to keep moving. I had to find the lake, the heart of whatever madness had taken hold of this place. I should have turned back, I knew it, but it was too late now. The path ahead was the only one I could follow. Eventually the trees parted and there it was, the lake. For a moment a wave of relief washed over me. It seemed normal. The lake wasn't the largest I'd ever seen, but it wasn't small either. About half a mile across, maybe more. On the far side I could just make out the silhouette of a cabin. I took a hesitant step forward, thinking maybe this was all some kind of mistake. Maybe it wasn't as bad as they said. But as I neared the shore, the air thickened. That metallic stench, the one I'd come to recognize as death, clung to the atmosphere, suffocating me with each breath. My stomach lurched and sweat broke out across my skin. I blinked, trying to shake the haze in my mind. But the world around me began to shift. What was once reality now felt fragile, like a thin pane of glass, cracking beneath the weight of something I couldn't understand. This wasn't a lake, not anymore. What had once been water had turned into a vast, pitch-black expanse, thick, tar-like liquid that shimmered beneath the low light. It moved, rippling unnaturally, as if something below the surface was making it churn, tugging at the edges of my sanity. I didn't need to see it to know. It was watching me. Something was pulling me closer, drawing me in. The liquid wasn't just liquid. It was alive. It wanted something from me. It felt like it knew me, like it had been waiting for me to arrive. There was no sound, no wind, no birds, no rustle of leaves. Just the undulating waves of that black liquid, and the air around me, vibrating with a low hum, as if the ground itself was alive with the same dark energy. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to turn around and flee before it was too late. My legs trembled beneath me, my heart hammering in my chest, but my body wouldn't obey. I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my gaze away. The fear wasn't gone, it was still there, but something else, something deeper, more dangerous, began to grow in its place, a strange pull, a longing. The thoughts swirled in my mind, whispered like a secret I couldn't ignore. Stay. My mind fought it, but it became harder and harder to tell fear from desire. I could feel the darkness calling, as if it knew me better than I knew myself. It was waiting, I was waiting. I stepped forward, just one step, but it felt like the world shifted beneath my feet. The ground beneath me was solid, yet somehow not. A warmth spread through my chest, unfamiliar and soothing, making the panic seem like a distant memory. I didn't want to fight it anymore. The lake, the darkness. It felt like home. It felt like release. I could jump. The thought seized me. What would it feel like to give in, to let the black liquid consume me completely? It felt like freedom, like everything that had burdened me, everything that had been dragging me down would disappear. The voice in my head, my voice, screamed at me to stop, to pull back. But it sounded so far away, like it belonged to someone else. Without even realizing it, I stepped closer, my foot hovering above the surface of the blackness. For a fleeting moment, my hand twitched as if reaching out, and I thought I saw something, a flicker, a glimmer, beneath the liquid, something watching me from the depths. I was so close. Just one more step and I would be consumed. Would it be painful or would it be a release? Run! The thought hit me like a jolt of electricity, a loud crack echoing in my skull, shattering the spell. For just a second, everything snapped back into focus. The town, Esther, the people I had left behind. My heart pounded in my chest, and I staggered backward, gasping for air. The weight of the blackness still pressing down on me like an invisible hand. I turned, my legs shaking, and stumbled away from the lake, away from whatever that thing was. Every instinct screamed at me to get as far from it as possible. I didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear. I wasn't meant to be here, not now, not like this. The distance between me and the lake grew, but the pull didn't fade. It lingered like a shadow that would follow me, haunting me until I understood what it wanted from me.